Well, welcome to the 700 Club. A failed narco state. That's what former U.S. Attorney General Bill Barr is calling Mexico. The kidnapping and killing of Americans in a Mexican border town is now spurring lawmakers to action.
Well, these lawmakers want to declare the country's drug cartels terrorist organizations so military force can be used against them. Ephraim Graham reports.
A road trip to Mexico for cosmetic surgery veered violently off course when 4 Americans were caught in a drug cartel shootout, leaving 2 dead and 2 held captive for days before being rescued. Officials say the 2 survivors are back on U.S. soil and recovering in a hospital in Brownsville, Texas. Their minivan came under fire shortly after they crossed into the border city of Matamoros on Friday. Cartel members hauled the Americans away in a truck. Mexican authorities searched for the hostages as the cartel moved them from place to place, eventually locating them in this shack in a remote area near the Gulf Coast. Latavia Tay McGee, a mother of 5, was found alive, according to her mother.
I had to hold my heart. I was thinking the Lord. I said, thank you, Jesus. There is a God.
Also rescued was Eric James Williams, but 2 other members of the group, Shaheed Woodard and Zindell Brown, were killed during the attack. Mexican officials say this was a case of mistaken identity. Investigators believe the gunmen may have targeted the vehicle because they wrongly believed the group were rival human traffickers. Tuesday, U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland said the Biden administration is fighting the cartels.
Look, the cartels are responsible for the deaths of Americans. And we are fighting as hard as possible. The DEA and the FBI are doing everything possible to dismantle and disrupt and ultimately prosecute the leaders of the cartels and the entire networks that they depend on.
But Senator Lindsey Graham says he's prepared to introduce legislation to allow the president to use military force in Mexico to combat drug cartels.
I'd put Mexico on notice. If you continue to give safe haven to fentanyl drug dealers, then you're an enemy of the United States.
Former Attorney General Bill Barr said the U.S. needs to fight the cartels the way it fought ISIS.
We have to use every tool. We have to use economic. We have to use intelligence assets, military assets, and law enforcement.
Mexican President Lopez Obrador has cautioned against foreign interference, saying that the Mexican government is working on the problem. But Barr calls Mexico a failed narco state and said the government is completely ineffective against the cartels.
The Mexican government is being held hostage by tens of thousands of paramilitary members of terrorist organizations that effectively control Mexico.
Barr says fentanyl, much of it coming from Mexico, kills more than 100,000 Americans a year. 21 state attorneys general want the drug cartels designated as terrorist groups. Ephraim Graham, CBN News.
Well, I hope this wakes our government up to finally protect our southern border. But it's not just that border. These things tend to morph. And anyone familiar with the war on drugs knows it keeps morphing. And whether that is the Colombian cartels, now it's the Mexican cartels, you clamp down on one, it seems to pop up in another place. But that doesn't mean we just give in and we say it's okay to have paramilitary groups just across our border. That should never be okay. And we absolutely should enforce our border and enforce our laws. Well, in other news, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell predicts a rough ride ahead for the economy. John Jessup has more on that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
That is right, Gordon. Investors are hoping for a quick rebound after Chairman Powell's tough questions at Tuesday's Senate hearing. The Fed chair testified that more rate hikes are likely and could come sooner than expected in the Federal Reserve's battle against stubbornly high inflation. CBN Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka has more.
Powell told senators that more rate hikes are likely and could come faster than expected as the Fed continues to try and battle stubbornly high inflation.
Although inflation has been moderating in recent months, the process of getting inflation back down to 2% has a long way to go and is likely to be bumpy.
Consumer spending got 2023 off to a strong start, but inflation remained high. Conventional wisdom has been that by slowly raising rates to cool off the economy, it will bring down that stubborn inflation.
If the totality of the data were to indicate that faster tightening is warranted, we'd be prepared to increase the pace of rate hikes.
Over the past year, interest rates have risen to about 4.6%, the highest level in nearly 15 years. Powell's risky plan is to use this method without throwing the economy into a recession. The Reserve projects 2023 to end with an unemployment rate of 4.6%, more than a full point higher than it is now. Historically, higher unemployment leads to less spending, although the result upsets some Democrats.
Chair Powell, if you could speak directly to the 2 million hardworking people who have decent jobs today, who you're planning to get fired over the next year, what would you say to them? How would you explain your view that they need to lose their jobs?
I would explain to people more broadly that inflation is extremely high and it's hurting the working people of this country badly. All of them, not just 2 million of them, but all of them are suffering under high inflation, and we are taking the only measures we have to bring inflation down.
The focus on the economy extended beyond Capitol Hill. The House Ways and Means Committee held a hearing in Oklahoma. Business owners there talked about the economic squeeze they're feeling.
We see firsthand how out of control costs have gotten in the last several years. Equipment costs have doubled. If you were to construct our building today, it would cost at least twice as much. And for supplies, we face both rising freight costs and parts on back order being commonplace.
President Biden, in his budget this week, will want to make it even harder to pass the family farm down to the next generation.
Powell also told senators that the debt ceiling needs to be raised, or there's a threat that long-term harm could be done to the economy. He'll take his plan to the Republican-controlled House today, where he's expected to be facing more tough questions about debt, inflation, and the economy. Matt Gelka, CBN News.
Thank you, Matt. Well, the origin of the COVID pandemic is the topic of a House investigation today. A subcommittee examining new evidence that the virus escaped from a lab in China. There are also questions whether some U.S. health officials actively tried to discredit that theory. CBN's Dale Hurd reports.
The Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic published emails Sunday in which Dr. Christian Andersen reportedly admits that Dr. Anthony Fauci, the former director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, prompted him to write a scientific paper on the origins of COVID-19, with the goal of disproving the theory the virus escaped from a laboratory in China and instead may have come from a so-called wet market where exotic animals are sold.
The fundamental question is, why was Dr. Fauci so consumed with making sure the narrative wasn't about the lab? I think it's because they were doing gain-of-function research there. He didn't want that out.
The Energy Department and the FBI now believe the lab leak theory to be true. The mainstream media claimed that the idea that COVID-19 originated in the Wuhan Institute of Virology had been debunked and was a conspiracy theory. Social media platforms labeled the lab leak theory misinformation and even censored it. Former CNN boss Jeff Zucker reportedly called the lab leak theory a Trump talking point and told reporters not to pursue it. The New York Times science reporter tweeted that the lab leak theory has racist roots. The Washington Post's Josh Rogan now admits the media suppressed the lab leak theory in part because of TDS, which stands for Trump derangement syndrome, opposing the lab leak theory simply because President Trump supported it. ABC's John Carl says the media now has egg on its face.
Look, some things may be true even if Donald Trump said them.
And we have the media and Democrats acting like defense attorneys for the Chinese instead of helping get to the bottom of what actually happened.
Republican Senator Ted Cruz has called for Dr. Anthony Fauci to face perjury charges for lying under oath to Congress about the origins of COVID-19. Ted Galen Carpenter writes that the media censorship of the lab leak theory has had serious fallout.
I think it should be an object lesson about the slippery slope of disinformation as a concept, how it can be used to stifle badly needed debates.
In a recent interview, Dr. Anthony Fauci said we may not ever know where the virus came from. Now more answers could be forthcoming after the Senate voted unanimously to declassify intelligence on COVID-19's origin. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
All right. Thank you, Dale. Gordon, back to you.
Well, there's a long list of disinformation campaigns, and you get behind that long list and you see politics in action. So, was there Russian collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government? Well, it's now been completely debunked. But the two-year nightmare that the nation went through in order to get to that place where it's been debunked. Then you have the New York Times saying that President Trump knew about a Russian bounty on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. Well, now that turns out to be completely bogus. There was no truth to it at all. Then the Wuhan lab. Now, you have a history here. The history is we funded that lab, which is just amazing. When most Americans hear that, they go, you've got to be kidding. But under the Obama administration, Fauci being involved, $3.5 million of U.S. taxpayers' money went into the Wuhan Institute of Virology to study SARS. And they went into bat caves to harvest these exotic viruses, and they brought them out into the sun and took them all the way to Wuhan. So when a virus that's related to a bat virus gets out into the open, everybody says, well, it's got to be the wet market problem. That's where SARS originated, so it's got to be that. And don't pay attention to this Wuhan Institute of Virology. At the same time, we're ignoring that there were lab leaks in similar labs in Beijing. We were ignoring a French report that the Wuhan Institute had lax standards. We ignored it all, and I think we did it for politics. That somehow if the virus was some weaponized thing, a gain of function by the Chinese military infiltrating, taking over that Wuhan lab in order to develop weapons, that somehow taxpayer money being involved, that would benefit President Trump in an election. And that's what we're dealing with. And it seems to be a coordinated effort among private companies that control media platforms, as well as political campaigns, as well as government employees. So will we ever get to the bottom of it? I don't know. Will Fauci actually face charges for perjury? I don't know. But we're into a place, can you trust anything? Can you trust what Congress is telling you? Can you trust what government employees who are supposed to tell us the truth and this is what's really happening? Can we trust media? And I think for all of us, we're saying, no, not anymore. I mean, you can fool me once, but when you do it the second, third, fourth, fifth time, you know, shame on me if I still believe you.